And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Network here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center, deep in the heart of the city we love, Providence, Rhode Island. The naked city, the city of, well, we just corrected about 560,000 stories. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course the mothership at coalitionradio.us. If you like this broadcast, if you could take a moment to follow us on Twitter or like us on Facebook, we'd be grateful. As independent media, we're very willing to talk about at length some of the most challenging subjects in American politics and culture today. We rely largely on the support of grassroots activists like our audience. Joining me now is someone I believe is going to give yet added texture and added, if you will, added layers of, how can I best put this? We've spent probably the last close to 3 years on and off covering the effort to decriminalize the efforts of sex workers. Starting back in really about 2016, Bella Robinson joined the show and has become a frequent, we like to say a frequent offender, a frequent contributor, from her position as running Coyote in the state. And then we reached out with the help of Bella and some other activists nationally. In the run-up to FOSTA-SESTA last year, we spent days of broadcasting trying to convince both the popular culture and, most importantly, our elected leaders that somehow criminalizing an act, a consensual act between two adults, for which there might be commerce involved, was simply wrong. It was immoral, and adding restrictions to it in the form of FOSTA and SESTA, essentially criminalizing communication between folks involved in a consensual act between adults where commerce was involved, would do nothing to enhance the lives of those involved. Simply, it would make their lives more dangerous, more economically challenging. And for a number of people who are already marginalized by the system and by our rather interesting outlook on sex and sex workers, it would place them in outright danger. So what we could continue to do is a few times a month have folks who are both involved in the community on a professional level and also folks who are simultaneously often activists, outspoken activists. We have them on the air here to give their perspective and their background and give them a chance to tell their story. Because ultimately, until we reach a point as a culture where that it's Pat and Jill and Bob, and in this case Maya, as opposed to the sex workers, as opposed to the labels. When we reach a point where we understand that we're all, and it's astonishingly cliched, we shouldn't be having this conversation in the year 2019, but we are all just regular folks taking on life's challenges as we best see fit, then people will still be in danger. We will marginalize people's lives. We will limit their human potential, and we will accomplish nothing other than to continue myths and to perpetuate lies. So it is with great pleasure that for the very first time on the Coalition Airwaves, I have Maya Morena. She is active in the sex worker community. She's also an outspoken activist. More than that, she's just really interesting. And we'll give out her Twitter feed at the end of the show and have an opportunity to follow her political tweets as they reflect on the lives of an ordinary person who is involved in what is really a very ordinary career. Maya, welcome to the Coalition. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So tell us, we never want to put folks in a position where they're uncomfortable, but tell us a little bit about your life. I know that you're quite outspoken about immigrant rights as well as sex worker rights on the interwebs, if you will. But tell us a little bit about your story, how you came to the United States, and at first, just give folks a sense of your background.
Yeah, sure. I originally was born in Torrijos, Honduras, in 1993. My parents came here to work under TPS from Honduras. Because of Hurricane Mitch, they were able to get the right to work temporarily. But unfortunately, they couldn't bring me with them because I didn't qualify for that visa it's not really a visa. It's like a temporary card, work authorization card. I didn't qualify because I wasn't, of age to work. And in order to have that card, you have to be able to work. So they kind of just they created this weird temporary worker class that has no status and that is undocumented, but has a social security card, can work legally and can drive legally, but are discouraged from bringing family or having any kind of permanence here. And that really wears away at people. So my parents originally were just going to work and save money and then have like a house for us in Honduras together. But I was staying with my grandparents when I was growing up, and we lived on a farm. And my grandmother was murdered by a bunch of people who came to the house and started shooting. So when word got back to my parents realized that it's not safe to have me there. My life was already under threat. So they decided to save up $10,000 to pay an organization, a smuggling organization, to smuggle me over. So I began that whole process. I traveled illegally across through Guatemala, Mexico, and then the U.S. And I was caught in Arizona. This was like during Bill Clinton's administration. So during the time he was implementing new policy, one of them called prevention through deterrence. And what that does is Border Patrol really guards urban areas, which is where people tend to move to go to work, right? You go from like a farmer area and you move to like more of the urban areas that have more of the jobs. And that happens in the States and outside the States as well. So they block those areas, and those areas are typically safer to go through. When they block those off, the migrants are forced to go through more dangerous terrains, like the Santa Clara Desert in Arizona. And that desert is great because then they can kind of put enforcement in the hands of nature. People die naturally of dehydration and the elements, and the vultures can eat apart their pieces so that there's no evidence that it has transpired. So it creates this really weaponization of nature and holistic kind of death thing. So I managed to survive, but I was like starving by the time that I was caught. Border Patrol put me in a jail cell as part of Bill Clinton's policy. I was 5 years old during the time. I was fingerprinted, had my picture taken. Luckily, I had memorized my parents' legal names, so they were able to track them down, and they lived in Long Island, New York. So then, they went through, I think it's HH something, but like they deal with child migrants that are caught at the border, and they located them. And I lived on Long Island since I was 6 years old. Went through William Floyd High School. Originally was going to go to like a private high-end college. That was like the goal. And I ended up getting into Mount Holyoke in Massachusetts. But like tuition was like $40K, and I couldn't afford it, and I couldn't get most scholarships. So there was a bust on that dream. Worked at AT&T, Bose, Oculus, like all these other companies. And then just kind of fell into sex work and really fell in love with nudity, fell in love with having sex, getting paid for it. So it became my business model. But it was weird because I always considered myself a feminist, but I get attacked by a lot of feminists, and a lot of feminists are responsible for some really horrific policies because they get into places of power and they start to speak for workers and speak for marginalized communities, and then they create laws because they think they know best, and it ends up being toxic. So the way that I got into activism, I'm sorry, the story is long.
No, this
I got a fellowship at Third Way Fund. They did the first ever sex worker giving circle. So it was an organization that wanted to listen to the voices of sex workers. So we made grants and we fundraised hundreds of thousands of dollars for sex worker led organizations by and for sex workers. We reviewed all the grant applications, and we were the ones that got the final say. So it was like a group of sex workers in the community in the New York area, and we were the first ones that did that. And that really taught me how corrupt philanthropy was, and it was like horrific. I heard someone say that philanthropy is like the rich man's like that's his arena of like where he can kind of, because it's great because it's not, you don't have to pay taxes if you put your money into a nonprofit, and that kind of makes sense as to why Hillary Clinton has her foundation and
Hmm.
Bill Clinton has his, right? It's, you put your money in there, you can ask for donations and you don't have to pay taxes on it. So it's like a way to kind of launder money and to kind of create like a system that's kind of feudalistic in nature. It's weird. So I started to research that more and got involved in Red Canary Song, a group that works with immigrant sex workers. And I went to Albany like a week ago. It was the first time we were allowed there, like to really speak to legislatures, and we got to speak at the $1 million staircase they had. I said a few words, got a couple of hateful comments, but it's been a lot of fun.
So you managed to survive a life-threatening border crossing, and the rigors of growing up in, in a that's amazing. Do you find that people are more comfortable in the myths that they've sort of created, and they don't want to be challenged when it comes to issues of sexuality, in particular people who embrace it as a career?
Um, you mean like people like me, or do you mean
No,
people like?
people, for example, in New York State, where you live, there are several women in power now, or have held positions of power. Ms. Gillibrand, Hillary Clinton, uh, you know, the congresswoman from Long Island has been particularly active, for example, in Second Amendment circles for obvious reasons. I guess Congresswoman Maloney. So you've got a tradition. You go back to someone named Bella Abzug. I don't know if you're familiar with her, but if not, you should look her up because her and Shirley Chisholm were really the first New York City women who embraced political adversity and were also elected to high office. So New York City and state has a tradition of embracing women, at least at a higher level than perhaps most of the country.
Mhm.
But at the same time, you point out what I've seen from my perspective as something of an outsider, but is that the current third wave of women and feminists are profoundly uncomfortable with discussing women like yourself who choose to engage in sexuality as a career. Why are they so uncomfortable? I mean, aren't you in a sense living the life of choice that they so at least say they firmly believe in?
It's kind of weird. I guess it's kind of like respectability politics, but I always say that I want to have diversity, but at the same time, diversity isn't going to fix our issues. Like you can elect a person of color or a woman into a position of power, but if she's doing the same thing that the corrupt, power structures were doing, then who cares if the person oppressing you is a man or a person of color? It's the same thing. It's the same system. Um, but I think, yeah, it's hard to get over the repression of sexuality, this kind of mentality, and we can like go over the history of where this even came from, really. But during the progressive era, there was like this new uprising and progressive. It really defined what progressivism is,
Mm-hmm.
was the progressive era. And both parties kind of embraced it, this idea that it is up to the state to moderate morality, so to speak. So they started talking about like the drug traffic, the alcohol traffic, the sex traffic. And that's really where kind of human trafficking as a concept really was born. It wasn't called that back in the day, it was called the white slave trade.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because during the time they were really policing brothels and sexuality. And, when they tried to get rid of virgin, I forgot what it was called, but something disease, when they were like
Yeah.
testing sex workers back in the day, one of the requirements that they did to get rid of it was to also ban alcohol, because they just thought all these bad things were related. And really, the issue is poverty.
Mm-hmm.
So they are targeting people who are poor, and so like there's a double standard where you see like the wealthier classes engaging in the same activities that all the other lower classes do, right? They do drugs, they have sex, they pay for sex, they do all this stuff. But it's not an issue when they do it, it's an issue when we do it. And we're the ones that like get policed very violently or,
Right.
you know.
Well, and one, we're up here in New England, and the name Robert Kraft obviously comes to mind.
Yeah.
Just I guess in the last day or so, despite them having video evidence of his adventures, the court has decided that they're going to throw out the video evidence. Which, on one side, as someone who believes in civil liberties and freedom, I absolutely, I'm thrilled. The courts should not be able to authorize law enforcement community to enter into the most private aspects of one's life, which includes their sexuality. They have no place being there, just simply none. And they certainly have no place arresting people and putting them in jail for it. But I found it fascinating that a man of extreme wealth, who, to be fair, has also been extremely generous to charities, but a man of extreme wealth had the legal power, the lawyers, the legal ammunition to suppress the video. I wonder how often in similar situations people of color or people of lesser means or marginalized would be able to fight that. And I think you and I know the answer. They wouldn't.
Yeah.
So, and early on in this case, it was all the allegations of trafficking abounded, and these folks were, as is almost typical, were found not to have been trafficked. They were engaging, they were doing it consensually. Now, their living conditions were very difficult, but
Well,
that...
I actually have like a thing to add. I actually worked in a massage parlor for a
Okay.
while. And I was following the case very closely from the beginning because I kind of knew it was coming. I've been like reading manuals that the US government has been putting out to stop trafficking, specifically one from Atlanta that I read in very great detail, and I posted it on my blog. You can actually find the link and download the PDF yourself, but they talk about how they're going to work with churches in the Atlanta area, schools, corporations, local law enforcement, and the feds and ICE. And they're going to change the culture to discourage buyers. And one of the things they're going to do is they're going to release photos, release names, and shame them after they do the prostitution things. Right. And they're going to shift the language, and they work with the media to do this. So, and they spell it out for you. But like, if you look at that thing and you realize that they do this with everything else, including drugs and alcohol, it starts to make sense that we don't have as much control as we think we do. And this stuff is out there, but like, you have to read the stuff that they're training behind closed doors to be doing. But sorry, specifically the massage parlors. I used to work for one. Basically, a lot of them tend to be owned by Asians, right? So like, you see a lot of immigrant communities tend to have certain businesses, right? So like, bodegas or nail salons, things like that. So for like the Asian community, a lot of them also do massage parlors. These women came legally, so they came with a visa. They applied to have a legitimate massage parlor business, and they had their licenses and everything. But obviously, you make more money doing, the hand jobs. Like, it makes more money that way. And when I worked for them, because I worked for a massage parlor, it was owned by like a Chinese man. And he basically told me like, hey, I don't know what you're going through, but if you, don't have a place to stay, you can stay here, right? You can use one of the places, get a blanket, a pillow, use it as a bed. We had a work place area where we could bring our snacks, we could just chill, and we worked together. It was like a collective business that we had going on. And, the rate for the hand job itself was a rate that was the same for all of us, but then you got to make up any other services you wanted to offer. So after you were done with that, the massage and the happy ending, then you could offer like, oh, for an additional, $100, I'll do this for you or this. You negotiate from there, and that is your profit. So it's a pretty, straightforward business model. It felt kind of family friendly, because we were just, people trying to get by. Mostly immigrants work in these locations, and they, speak their own language because that's more comfortable. You notice whenever you go to like certain places where they have Latinos working in the back, they speak in Spanish, and that creates camaraderie in the workplace. So when I was reading the reports, like the way they made everything sound was like it was so horrible. They're working all these long hours and they only speak Chinese, so they can't ask for help and they can't leave. They sleep here and work here. Like they made it sound horrible. Like they have a little snack area and it's like just shitty food or something like that. Like they just made it sound like these women are shackled there and like they're forced to work, and it's so horrible.
Wow. Yeah. No, I.
Getting hand jobs isn't that hard. Like it's one of the easiest sexual jobs you could have. Yeah, and it got worse and worse, right? So like the police gave the place a bomb threat in order to set up cameras so they could report it, and they reported it for like 6 months. Then they went in and using taxpayer money, they paid for hand jobs, and they recorded all of this stuff. So if these women were in fact, sex trafficked victims or slaves, as they said, and because I watched the videos where the police came out as heroes, like, these women are the real victims, like kind of like that. Why would you do that to sex trafficked victims or slaves? Like, why would you film them and then have them service you and then film them and then just leave them there for 6 months?
Right. Where was the sense of urgency if, in fact, they were oppressed or they were under direct physical threat? There was
What
none.
people don't understand is that there is a visa for sex trafficking. I believe it's the U visa, and that's for human trafficking. But the definition of human trafficking is very specific, right? You have to be forced, coerced, usually through fraud. You don't need to have sex with these women to prove that. You don't even need to like watch them having sex in order to prove any of this. You just have to like go through their documents. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
there's no need to do prostitution things at all. So it doesn't make any sense. Anyway.
No, and I appreciate you sharing with that. To me, what's fascinating, I love your reaction to this. There are those folks in the anti-trafficking world who, by the way, can make a healthy living accomplishing really nothing but acting like they're anti-traffickers. And they will talk endlessly about the use of one's body. But is it fair to say that in most employment, particularly in any one of the trades, you are always essentially being paid to give up your body? What's the difference between the two in your mind? Is there any difference?
Yeah, I'm always baffled by the obsession, and I try to like debate them out of that, but it's like so difficult, and I just have to like give up and realize that really for them it's a morality issue. It's
Right.
these women are good and these women are bad. But yeah, I've noticed that trend too when it comes to human trafficking, is that it's been hijacked. So I talked about the history of the progressive era, but there's a more modern history. Human trafficking as a concept began in the UN. So a bunch of governments gathered together and decided to describe a special kind of exploitation that's happening in the global community, in the new global economy due to globalization, right?
Right.
So they brought in experts who study hidden populations. So people who are underground, and specifically of the new smuggling trade and the immigration that's happening. So that very specific exploitation in those groups. And what I've seen is that the term human trafficking has been completely hijacked. And now it's just the sex industry. The
Right.
sex industry is human trafficking. It's women who are being commodified, and but it's weird because when I talk to these people who are anti-trafficking, they literally reduce me to an object. Like, I'm not a human being to them. I'm just, oh yeah, you're oppressed and you're an object and you wouldn't exist if it wasn't for demand, and if we just get rid of demand, then you wouldn't exist. And it's like, I'm not an object though. I'm a human being, and the people who buy my stuff are human beings. Like, it's not going to go away. And demand. Like
It's sexuality. It can't go away. We're biologically wired to desire, on both on a physical and a philosophical and just on a human sense, intimate contact with other people. Some of us are wired differently in how we achieve that, but it's just part of humanity. It can't
Yeah.
possibly go away. And
I
so,
feel like they devalue our labor, and it does so many bad things. Like the philosophy of how they view this is really horrific because they ignore the exploitation that happens in labor.
right,
And it's so rampant. Like in my country, in Honduras, like we have a child labor issue. You know, children are making your coffee, they're making your shoes, and it's not a secret. Like everyone knows, but like, they're so convinced the issue is the sex industry. And I really think that they really aren't listening to like economics or basic common sense. Like, why would I be more exploited in an industry where the average rate of pay is like 100 an hour or more? You know, someone would make like 600, 800, $1,000 an hour. Like, you know, like other people work hours on end, like more than 40 hours a week, making like $10, $5, $2.
well, and here's the tragic irony. Folks from Central America very often, and at least in some cases, flee their countries because of economic pressures, human rights issues, narco-terrorism, which, by the way, a lot of it is under the direct influence of the American political system. I would imagine they're more likely, if they're being trafficked, almost exponentially higher level of trafficking in agriculture. I mean, that's where people are being paid literally nothing. And yet the American corporate culture just sees them as just a part of the food chain. I'm not aware of these overwhelming multi-million-dollar organizations being financed to root out human trafficking along the California coast or into the middle states and to rescue small children from desperate child labor situations. I haven't seen that yet. Maybe it's out there. I could be wrong, but
Yeah. For me, it's definitely a workers' rights issue because, obviously corporations ship jobs overseas or businesses because there's less labor rights over there. So, they also like hire third parties. So they'll hire another business to
Right.
do the exploitative business practices so they can avoid liability. But they're like, you have to go out and hire these people and make this amount of profit. And the only way they can hit that goal and keep getting hired is if they break the law. And then that third party becomes liable.
Right.
But that's the way they hire it, and they do it specifically for that reason. But yeah, they're not talking about this stuff. They don't really care. It's just, and I think a lot of it is just that they're being paid money and they know the way to get attention is by going off on the sex industry.
Well, and as you pointed out, the techniques being used on the war on drugs have been exported to the war on sex workers. And it is a war at this point.
Yeah, they're both being used at the same time, and it's horrific. Like in Honduras, the only way you can get loans, so from like the World Bank or what the other one's called, monetary fund,
the IMF,
and U.S. foreign aid is if you put certain laws into place. So there's like a bunch of conditions you have to meet, and one of them is to pass anti-prostitution laws, anti-trafficking laws. And then the U.S. funds those police forces and trains them and gives them weapons. Same thing with the whole drug thing. They do the same thing. So, yeah, prohibition isn't working, and they don't call it prohibition, obviously, because then you're going to think about alcohol, and you're going to be like, well, it didn't work, so why can't we? If they called it prohibition, it would end a lot faster, but they don't.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. Ultimately, we live in a society that, particularly here in the United States, where we keep committing the same errors. We will criminalize a behavior, and then we're shocked to find people in desperate situations, or we're shocked to find people who, because they have to hide, they're often the victims of discrimination and very often violence. I can remember seeing, on some of the hobbyist boards, it was brought to my attention that in the days post FOSTA-SESTA, there were people gleefully proclaiming that they could pay a lot less and they could probably get away with a lot more, and the implication being that there would be violence or potential violence, that it would be okay because of the fear of prosecution, that they can be rougher. And that was everywhere. That wasn't just some conflated single example.
Yeah, it was everywhere. It was, no, I'm really sad, especially for more vulnerable people. 'Cause it's been really devastating to see. And like, I'm friends with a lot of people who are trans or people of color or other immigrants, and it's been devastating. As soon as it passed, like there were, you know, I call them management. That's what I call them. Other people call them pimps, whatever, but like I call them management, but they were reaching out and they're like, oh, you need me now.
Right.
Like I had an agency hit me up that I worked at once, and I didn't like it because like the profits that they take from you is just ridiculous. It's like they take more than 50% of what you make. So like, but they hit me up immediately. And also like Pornhub, as soon as the FOSTA passed, like they tweeted and they were like, oh, we're so sorry that Sister FOSTA passed. We'll take the refugees. You can come upload content on our platform. And if you don't know what Pornhub is, it was a company made by two tech guys. One of them created it and started it, and then Fabian, Fabian, invested in it and got a bank loan, was able to start a profitable business. And his business model was, porn should be free. I am going to steal all these videos from these directors and these companies and these performers and just upload them for free. And like users can just upload the stolen content. And there's no age verification needed, right? Because you're not paying for it anymore. It's just widely accessible. And because people don't respect sex workers, now we have a bunch of piracy sites. And that man not only owns Pornhub, but he bought up other porn companies, I think like Bang Bros and other ones. And he also owns other piracy sites. So it becomes the cycle of like, he owns all of the companies that produce the content, then he owns the companies that steal that content, and it's a loop.
Right, and they're able to use criminalization to suppress wages, and really to
for them, because the thing is, these guys are in the tech world, right? And no one wants to put in monopoly laws or enforce the ones we already have. So they're allowed to do whatever they want. So whenever there's laws against the sex industry, it impacts sex workers and directors and producers. It doesn't impact the tech guys or the tech people.
And it's amazing because when you think about tech, intellectual property rights are such an important part of their lives, and yet at the same time, with the compliant nature of the government, they're willing to monetize stolen intellectual property, stolen product, and make enormous amounts of money off it because of advertising and affiliate programs and all this indirect marketing, ancillary money. It's astonishing to watch the notion that shutting down, because essentially for the listeners who aren't familiar with FOSTA-SESTA, you are essentially criminalizing electronic communications between people involved in sex work, which sounds like a great thing if you simply don't understand the real issues. But in doing so, simultaneously made it extremely more difficult for folks in the sex industry to screen, to communicate, and quite frankly, for you as a young woman to operate an independent business and control your likeness, control your marketing. It just made it exponentially more difficult, which had the potential and has happened on so many times to drive people back to this sort of marginalized existence when at a certain point they were starting to exhibit economic freedom. And it's so what's astonishing about your background is that you've been able to overcome a lot of these issues, in this post-SESTA world. And you think of all the people who just weren't able to do that. The death rate now actual deaths of folks in the trans community is through the roof. People are disappearing, all under the guise of this largely upper class, white dominated, professional savior industry. The notion that we have an organization in Rhode Island called Day One, which has brings in a couple $1 million a year of grants. What they spend the money on in terms of actual helping women who have allegedly been trafficked, for women who want to get off the streets, is virtually nil. They've got plenty of programs and plenty of marketing, and the owner of this, the proprietor of this, on her foundation tax paperwork, makes almost $190,000 a year, quote unquote, saving people from themselves, when in fact it's like the drug interdiction company, the drug support recovery.
Yeah.
They don't really do anything.
Yeah, I have guide stars, so I've been like reading up on these companies and trying to find out what they actually do, and a lot of them are just advocacy
Yeah.
companies. I even read a report, sex trafficking in New York. I talked about it on Twitter and went over it, but they treated like they were basically talking about street kids, ghetto kids, bad kids, right? Kids that miss school, kids whose parents are on welfare, kids who are poor. Those are the kids they were talking about when they were talking about sex traffic. And you could tell because they use, like, the language they use is horrific. Like, they use the word recidivism. I don't know how to pronounce it. But it's basically a word that describes when a criminal reoffends.
Right.
They talked about these kids having a high recidivism rate. Like, they said it 3 times and had, like, 2 paragraphs about how, these kids, like, you can't fix them. These sex trafficked kids, they're just going to keep reoffending. It takes multiple interventions to get them to change. It was horrific to read it because these are underage kids, It's like they're not criminals. They're not bad kids. It's just that, here's the thing. We want to act like all this stuff is a third world country issue, like, oh, child labor is horrible and it happens overseas. But it's happening in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
That's what all these kids selling drugs and selling sex and like, running away from abusive parents and having to do underground work. That's what that is. That's child labor. They don't want to call it that because then they would have like a serious problem and you'd probably have to blame the system. So they don't call it that. They call it sex trafficking, and then they treat the kids like they're criminals and they're the bad ones. So yeah, it was devastating to read the report, but like basically their solution was, we can't change these kids. They're basically a lost cause. So our goal is going to be prevention. And that's the most important thing we need to focus on right now. They do the same thing with drugs as well.
Right.
Prevention. So educating the public, changing the culture, give us $50,000 to, well, sorry, it was $5 million.
Right.
$5 million to do advertising, to do training, to, teach schools, to teach kids not to become street kids, basically, not to do drugs, don't be bad. Prevention. So
right.
And they specifically said in their thing, because the thing is, all these issues that impact, children in this economy also impact everyone else. So the main issue is homelessness, right? A lot of these kids are homeless. They need to work to survive, so they do drugs, or they sell drugs, or they sell sex.
Survival sex, yeah.
Yeah, so problem is homelessness. And, they said specifically, we only have like 50 beds for, these kinds of kids in the state of New York. So we don't have enough because there's thousands of kids that are running away from home, that are homeless, that have nobody who cares about them. And they specifically said in their proposal, well, we don't want public housing. We want like small residential like places, but mostly we want to focus on prevention. And the reason why they want those small, like, little housing is because they don't want housing to be a human right. They want it to be like very controlled. So the places that they put these kids in are, they're locked from like the outside. The phone calls are all monitored. These kids aren't free to come and go it's basically a prison. Usually these kids end up in juvie or in the orphanage system. Again, like another underfunded, horrible system. And or like these rehabilitation programs that are supposed to like change them.
Right.
But for the most part, all the money goes toward prevention. And that's why everyone is so paranoid about human trafficking. But like you'll talk to them and they don't really know what it is.
Right.
Like they'll be, oh, I saw them be taken. That's what it is.
And so as a result, you've got taxpayer money again supporting the poverty to prison pipeline. It's a direct channeling. And the worst part of it for me is that these people are portrayed as local heroes.
That's the most horrific part.
I mean, from my perspective anyway, I mean, because, they're shown as, you know, just wonderful moral people who are trying to do the right thing, when in fact so many of them are just in it for the money. It's just another
Yeah.
government program to exploit.
Yeah. It's I've always said this, but like you cannot actually speak for the voiceless. There's that whole kind of idea that like they're the here's the thing, like I know kids like this. I grew up with them. Like I'm on Long Island and I wasn't rich. So like, when you go to school, kids like this that sell drugs, that do drugs, that are selling sex, that might be selling nudes. I grew up with that in high school. With kids like working, mowing the lawns or, shoveling snow to help their parents or their family. Like, poverty is such a huge issue that's impacting everyone.
Hmm.
And the government just kind of ignores it. They don't want to call that, child labor or think about why it's necessary for some kids. And it even happens to my little sisters. I still have little sisters at home on Long Island, and they're in high school, and they tell me about their friend who's a drug dealer, and he's just a normal kid. Or, the girl who sells nudes so she can buy video games, like maybe 17 years old. But, like, this is the reality, but, like, politicians don't want to talk about it because they want to pretend like this stuff just doesn't happen.
Right.
So instead, you have, like, hundreds of thousands of kids that end up through this horrific system, I had a friend growing up. He was actually a white kid. He was about, like, 17 when I was like 14 or something. I think the age difference was 6 years old. So he was older than me, but he was a drug dealer. And he was one of the nicest people like the nicest white guy you ever met, just an amazing teenager. Like he would give people money because he had excessive money because he was a drug dealer. He would help people out all the time. Like if you ever get bullied, you come to me, I'll take care of it for you. But he told me, like, growing up, that the police were always on him, right? Because he was the poor white kid. He's the white trash kid.
Right.
So they were always harassing him and charging him. They eventually put him away as a teenager for, like, a couple of years. Yeah, it was horrific. Like, that's not going to help anybody.
Right. No,
I don't think they're bad kids. They're dealing with a system that has failed them. And, when you put it that way, it becomes real. And that puts pressure on politicians because they don't want to acknowledge the reality or acknowledge how the system they created is causing these conditions.
No, it's wherever you go in the country, folks tend to generalize Long Island as being, they think of the North Shore, 5 towns, places like that as being, centers of wealth. Well, there's also towns like
Yeah,
towns like Uniondale, I mean, are just as likely to be as rough as suburbs of Detroit as they are likely to be. And you look at the issues with meth and issues like that in the central part of the country.
Drug problem in Long Island. Yeah, like there's some places in Long Island because my parents both work out in the Hamptons, so there's like extreme wealth here. People who can afford like hundreds of thousands of dollars in security for like a panic room, to have like a bomb shelter kind of thing. Famous celebrities like to come here and golf and have a summer home. But yeah, there's some rougher neighborhoods, and we get severely underfunded. We get screwed over because our zip code isn't as wealthy, so we get worse education. Some schools don't have access to AP classes. Yeah, the wealth inequality here is like really bad. But no one wants to really talk about it, right? Because if it's a bad neighborhood, if it's a poor neighborhood, then who cares if they're being ravaged by drugs and MS-13 and gangs and
the police.
All this other stuff? It doesn't matter until it like impacts the wealthy communities. Like MS-13 predominantly kills immigrant children. That's who they mostly murdered. And the police out in Suffolk County didn't care. So ProPublica actually published several investigative reports where the police didn't even investigate immigrant kids that died or were murdered by MS-13. Like the parents would go to them, and they would write it down as a murder-suicide and not investigate at all. And it creates this horrible environment where you can't trust the police because they don't even like research missing children if they're like immigrants or if they're brown. And it didn't become a problem until like MS-13 killed, a white girl from a wealthy neighborhood in Long Island.
Right.
Then all of a sudden, MS-13 was a huge problem. Yeah.
What do you? We've only got a couple more minutes, and I hope you'll come back and join us again. I'd love to, if you're doing any writing, any of your political work, I hope you'll you share with us so that we can amplify it in whatever little way we can. We're an independent media outlet in central New England. We don't pretend to be the New York Times, but we're relentless in terms of the issues we'll talk about. The more challenging, the more important it is to us. You've got a significant ally community out there, and I'm interested to understand what you think the effectiveness of the ally community has been. I'm talking about academics. I'm talking about independent media types like myself. Do you think we're channeling our energies in the right place? I mean, overall, I know it's a broad question, but it's got to be interesting because you've got, on one hand, you've got these government-sponsored know-it-alls who are basically profiting off of I don't want to say your misery, but they're profiting off of a role or a place that they're putting you in.
I say like they're profiting off of the worker class,
right?
The lower classes, because I really do think we're all the same. Mm-hmm. Some people might be more persecuted than others, but we're really all the same. And I think that there's certain things that the media and the government says that kind of create division. So like, as much as I love talking about, people of color and like all these intersectional issues, at the same time, like we're really all the same, like we're being hurt by the same system. So I do think independent media is the way to go because they're the only ones that really cover different stuff. And that's where I've been trying to put my energy in. I think I tried to do like mainstream once and they cut out everything I said and only got like my reactions to stuff. Like they mentioned Ashton Kutcher and I laughed because Ashton Kutcher's, one of those people that's trying to save sex trafficked victims and it's all bullshit. So like I laughed and that was the only clip they left. So they left all the meat that I was talking about.
Right.
So I definitely think independent media is very important and definitely think that people should donate. Hint, hint.
Yeah. It's a lot of us do this for pure love of the work as opposed to any thoughts that we're going to be.
Yeah, when I worked with, it's weird because I'm starting to get asked to be on things, and even when I did like a magazine cover and they liked my activism, so they talked to me about important issues. Like there were moments where they're like, "Oh, we have to do this because we're being paid to." Put on this jacket. And it was like a horrific jacket, a horrific skirt, just disgustingly ugly. But you had to promote it because these companies were paying for it.
Right. Well,
yeah.
Crazy stuff. Well, tonight wasn't enough time. We were running a little late, but I thank you so much for joining us. And again, please, there's a lot of us out there, I guess you roughly call us allies. If you're writing something or an article or you're appearing somewhere, let us know so that we can share it. The collective power of independent media, I don't think has really been realized yet. And that's because we all need to work together a little bit more. And just not worry about turf and things like that, but just see commonality in the issues. And everything else will ultimately take care of itself. So how can folks follow you, read you, cite your website? Do you have a Twitter you want to share with us? Or how can folks get in touch with you?
Sure. It's Maya Morena XXX. It's MAYAMORENA XXX. And then Instagram is Maya Morena with one X. My blog is just mayamorena.com. So it's pretty simple. But like there you'll be able to like see the podcasts I've done, videos, stuff like that.
Excellent. Well, again, thank you for coming on tonight, and let's stay in touch. And particularly if you find your way up to New England at all, let us know so that we can have you in studio and continue the conversation.
Cool. Thank you.
All right. Maya Moreno joining us live somewhere from in the wonderful state of New York, bringing to us some a really intimate look at her experiences both as a young person and an adult working, I want to emphasize, by choice as a sex worker and in the adult entertainment community. There's been no trafficking here, no, you haven't been forced to appear on this show. You're here of your own free will. And I congratulate you both on your spirit. You're very articulate, and your command of the facts, I think, will only help you in your activism. So I applaud that, the type of research you've done. And again, I hope we talk again soon.
Thank you so much.
All
Have a
right.
good day.
Folks, we're going to take a quick break now. We're running about 20 minutes late, but it's been worth every moment of it tonight. We are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Media Network here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course the mothership at coalitionradio.us. Please take a moment to follow us or like us on social media. Again, as always, independent media can only survive. We don't have the big marketing bucks that the guys, the New York Times or any of those guys have, so we rely on your support. And quite frankly, that's the simplest way to do it. Folks, stay tuned. We're going to have Tom Arnold next. We're going to talk about the libertarian movement and its statement of principles. We'll be right back.